I always thought the strange, heavy scraping noises vibrating inside my new house were just the old copper plumbing adjusting to the freezing weather, until the terrifying night I discovered that someone had been quietly unlocking the heavy steel deadbolt of my hidden crawlspace hatch from the inside. Buying my very first home at the age of 28 was supposed to be the absolute crowning achievement of my independent adult life. A hard-earned financial reward after years of working exhausting double shifts and living in cramped, noisy city apartments where genuine privacy was nothing more than an unaffordable luxury. The property itself was a charming, albeit slightly weathered and neglected, two-story colonial house located at the absolute end of a quiet, heavily wooded cul-de-sac in a secluded suburb of Connecticut, priced suspiciously below the local market value because the previous elderly owner had passed away suddenly without leaving a valid will or any surviving relatives to claim the estate. I spent the first 3 days of my occupancy completely alone in the echoing structure, drowning in an endless, frustrating sea of heavy cardboard boxes, rolls of plastic packing tape, and old wooden furniture, slowly trying to make the unfamiliar space feel like a genuine home while a relentless autumn rain beat a heavy, hypnotic rhythm against the thin glass window panes. By the fourth night, the exhausting physical labor of moving had completely caught up with me, leaving my muscles aching and my eyes burning with deep fatigue as I sat cross-legged on the living room floor at exactly 2 a.m., nursing a lukewarm cup of bitter coffee while surrounded by the eerie, unmoving shadows of half-unpacked boxes. The house was intensely, suffocatingly quiet, the kind of deep suburban silence that makes you acutely aware of every minor creak in the old floorboards, the distant hum of the ancient refrigerator, and every heavy groan of the structural rafters as the massive building slowly settled into the cold, damp earth. As I stood up from the floor to finally head upstairs to bed, a sudden, distinct scraping sound echoed from beneath the hardwood floorboards directly under my bare feet, a dry, metallic friction that sounded exactly like a heavy iron bolt being slowly, deliberately forced out of a rusted mounting bracket. I froze instantly in place, my heart hammering violently against my ribs like a trapped bird, my eyes darting frantically across the empty room as I tried to desperately rationalize the noise as a rogue stray animal that had slipped into the foundation, or perhaps just an air bubble trapped inside the aging water pipes that ran through the dark basement. But my anxiety refused to settle, driven by a primal survival instinct that told me the sound was far too deliberate, far too heavy to be a mere plumbing glitch or a small rodent, forcing me to put down my coffee mug and grab the heavy tactical flashlight I kept inside my emergency toolkit. I walked back to the center of the room and pulled back the thick, ornate oriental rug that the previous owner had left behind, and my breath hitched painfully in my throat when my bright flashlight beam illuminated a perfectly square, seamlessly cut hatch in the oak wood that I had completely missed during my initial walkthrough with the real estate agent. The wooden hatch was secured with an oversized, modern deadbolt lock, but the metal latch was now hanging completely loose, the screws cleanly removed and lying on the floor, leaving a dark, 3-inch gap exposed to the freezing air of the hidden crawlspace below. A foul, oppressive stench wafted up from the narrow opening, a sickening mixture of damp soil, stagnant water, and old copper that made my stomach churn with immediate, violent nausea as I knelt down on the cold floorboards to peer directly into the abyss. I lowered my flashlight into the dark gap, the thin beam of light cutting through a thick, ancient curtain of cobwebs and gray dust, revealing a low-ceilinged dirt cellar that stretched out into the absolute darkness beneath the entire length of the house. As I tracked the light across the damp earth, the beam suddenly caught on something that made my blood run entirely cold. Tucked neatly into the far corner of the crawl space, directly beneath the exact spot where my bedroom was located upstairs, was a makeshift living space consisting of a dirty sleeping bag, several empty cans of non-perishable food with incredibly recent expiration dates, and a collection of Polaroid photographs pinned to the wooden support beams. With trembling fingers, I leaned closer to the hatch to get a better look at the images, and a wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over me when I realized every single photograph was of me, taken from the dense tree line outside over the past 3 days, clearly showing me unpacking my car, eating dinner alone in the kitchen, and sleeping soundly in my bed. I scrambled backward across the hardwood floor in a blind panic, my mind completely fracturing at the terrifying realization that a malicious intruder had been living directly beneath my feet, watching my every move through the floor vents since the very hour I moved into the house. Before I could even grab my phone to dial emergency services, the battery icon on my screen violently flashed a critical 1% and died completely, plunging me into a helpless, dark isolation while a sudden, heavy thud echoed from inside the very wall right behind where I stood trembling. I watched in absolute, paralyzing horror as the small metal grate of the wall-mounted air vent slowly, quietly popped out of its metal frame, falling onto the carpet with a soft thud, and a long, impossibly thin human hand with dirt-caked fingernails slid out from the dark ventilation shaft. A pale face slowly followed, emerging into the dim moonlight. A gaunt, unwashed man with wide, sunken eyes that carried a look of pure, manic obsession. His lips split into a wide, silent grin as he stared directly into my eyes from the floor level. He didn't speak, he didn't scream. He simply began to squeeze his emaciated, deformed body through the narrow vent opening with a horrifyingly fluid, practiced motion, his joints popping loudly in the quiet room as he cut off my only exit to the front door, leaving me completely trapped in the dark with a monster who had laid claim to my new home long before I ever signed a deed. Leaving me to realize that the suffocating silence of the suburbs was a trap from which I might never escape. Alive. I spent weeks clearing out the heating duct of my newly rented suburban home because of a strange, rhythmic scratching noise, only to discover that someone had lined the inside of the narrow metal vents with thick blankets to deaden the sound of their voice while they watched me sleep. When my wife and I finally managed to escape our cramped city apartment to rent a beautiful, newly renovated mid-century modern house in the suburbs of Ohio, we truly believed we had found the perfect sanctuary to raise our future family in absolute safety. The property was completely surrounded by a dense acre of ancient oak trees, providing a level of privacy we had only ever dreamed of, and the landlords were an incredibly polite, elderly couple who lived 2 towns away and seemed eager to hand over the keys without a thorough background check or any complicated paperwork. The first few weeks were a blur of excitement and physical exhaustion as we painted the walls, assembled flat-pack furniture, and filled the bright, spacious rooms with our personal belongings, completely ignoring the vague, underlying sense of cold unease that always seemed to linger in the long, narrow hallway connecting the bedrooms. It wasn't until my wife left for a 3-day corporate conference in Chicago that the true, unsettling nature of the house began to manifest itself in the dead of night, transforming our dream home into a claustrophobic psychological prison. It was exactly 3 a.m. on a freezing Tuesday morning when I was abruptly awakened from a deep sleep by a low, faint sound vibrating through the master bedroom. A dry, rhythmic scratching that sounded like someone was dragging a sharp object across a metallic surface. I sat up in the dark bed, the cold sheets pulled tight against my chest, listening intently as the noise faded away, only to be replaced by a low, raspy whistling sound coming directly from the large rectangular heating vent mounted near the base of the wall opposite my bed. I crept out of bed, my bare feet freezing against the hardwood floor, and knelt down in front of the metal grate, assuming a stray bird or a large rodent had somehow gotten trapped inside the intricate ductwork system of the old house. But as I pressed my ear against the cold iron louvers, the whistling sound abruptly stopped, replaced by a sound that caused a violent jolt of pure adrenaline to surge straight through my veins. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of a human throat clearing, followed by a low, rhythmic scratching of fingernails against the inside of the metal pipe. I scrambled backward, dropping my flashlight as my mind raced to find a logical explanation. desperately trying to tell myself that the sound was just an echo traveling from the exterior furnace unit or a trick played by my sleep-deprived mind in an unfamiliar environment. I stayed awake for the remainder of the night, staring at the dark vent in absolute silence. But the noise did not return until the following evening at the exact same hour, when the rhythmic scratching began anew, louder and more aggressive than before. This time, the scratching was accompanied by a low, guttural whisper that vibrated through the metal vents, a distorted, multi-tonal voice that seemed to bounce through the entire ventilation system of the house, softly repeating my own name over and over again in a mocking, sing-song cadence that made my skin crawl with pure dread. Driven by a desperate need to find the source of the disturbance and reclaim my sanity, I went down to the kitchen the next morning, grabbed a screwdriver from the junk drawer, and systematically began removing the metal grates from every single vent on the ground floor, finding nothing but dust and old insulation fibers. It wasn't until I entered the deep, unfinished crawl space beneath the house, a dark, concrete void that smelled of damp earth and old copper, that I found the terrifying truth hidden behind the modern drywall. My flashlight beam tracked the long, silver line of the main heating duct running along the wooden ceiling beams, and my heart completely dropped when I noticed a massive, crudely cut square hole inside of the main trunk line, hidden directly behind a false wooden panel in the foundation wall. I crawled slowly toward the opening, the cold dirt scraping against my knees, and when I shone my light inside the hollow metal shaft, a gasp of pure horror caught in my throat. The interior of the duct had been lined with old blankets to deaden sound, and sitting in the center of the shaft was a pair of dirty binoculars, a collection of my wife's missing hair ties, and a handwritten notebook detailing our daily schedules down to the exact minute we left for work and turned off the lights. The realization crashed over me like a tidal wave. Someone had been living inside the structural walls of our home, navigating the dark ductwork like a parasite, watching us through the narrow slits of the vents while we slept in our beds. Before I could even back out of the crawl space to safety, the heavy wooden trapdoor above my head suddenly slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging me into absolute pitch-black darkness, and from the narrow metal opening of the duct right next to my face, I heard the distinct, heavy sound of slow, ragged breathing, followed by a low, familiar whisper that sounded mere inches from my ear, welcoming me to my new home and letting me know that I was completely trapped in the dark with no escape. I pulled into the driveway of my new historic home at 3:15 a.m., only to freeze in pure terror as I saw a tall, solid human silhouette standing perfectly still behind the glass of the attic window, a sealed room that had no floorboards and no functioning electrical wiring. We moved into the historic house on Elm Street during the final rain-soaked week of August, an incredibly oppressive, humid stretch of summer that made the grueling task of carrying dozens of heavy cardboard boxes up the winding front steps feel like a form of physical torture. The property was a beautiful, majestic Victorian estate that had sat completely abandoned on the competitive real estate market for over 3 years. A neglected architectural gem with a sprawling wraparound porch, multicolored stained glass windows, and a massive, uninsulated attic that sat like a silent, threatening monolith atop the 3rd floor of the structure. My younger brother and I had managed to secure the lease for an incredibly cheap monthly rent, completely choosing to ignore the persistent local rumors that the previous family had mysteriously fled the property in the middle of the night, abandoning all their worldly possessions behind in their absolute rush to escape. The first 3 nights inside our new home were completely unease-filled, characterized by an oppressive, heavy atmosphere that seemed to saturate the very air inside the high-ceilinged rooms, making every single space feel strangely claustrophobic despite the open floor plan and large entryways. On the 4th night, I was coming back from a late-night grocery run to the local 24-hour convenience store, slowly pulling my car into the dark gravel driveway at exactly 3:15 a.m. while the rest of the neighborhood slept soundly under a thick blanket of absolute suburban silence. As I opened the creaking car door to step out into the humid night air, my eyes naturally drifted upward toward the topmost peak of the house. With a solitary, arched window of the third-floor attic looked out over the front yard like a dark, watchful eye. My hand froze instantly on the steering wheel, and my breath hitched painfully in my throat as I noticed a sudden, distinct movement behind the dusty glass panes. A tall, completely solid human silhouette was standing perfectly still in the dead center of the window, its dark outline illuminated from behind by a faint, sickly green glow that shouldn't have physically existed in a portion of the house with no functioning electrical wiring. I stared in absolute, paralyzing fascination as the tall figure slowly leaned its head forward against the glass, its long, distorted arms reaching out to press its massive palms perfectly flat against the window pane, as if it was staring directly down at me through the pitch-black darkness of the overgrown front yard. I blinked my eyes violently, desperately trying to convince myself that the extreme summer heat and my own deep physical exhaustion were causing me to hallucinate strange shapes in the pale moonlight. But when I opened my eyes again, the silhouette had vanished into the shadows, leaving nothing but the empty, dark window frame staring back at me. Driven by a volatile mix of intense anger, frustration, and mounting paranoia, I marched quickly up the wooden front steps, unlocked the heavy entrance door, and entered the house, fully determined to prove to myself that a common intruder had broken into our home and was currently hiding in the upper levels. I grabbed a heavy aluminum baseball bat from the hall closet and began the long, completely silent ascent up the grand staircase, my heart hammering a frantic, echoing rhythm against my ribs as I carefully passed the quiet bedrooms where my younger brother was soundly sleeping. The air grew progressively colder, damp, and incredibly heavy with the unmistakable, putrid smell of stagnant water and rotting wood as I finally reached the narrow, hidden door that led straight to the third-floor attic stairs, its iron hinges emitting a loud, mournful groan as I pushed it open. I climbed the steep, creaking wooden steps one by one, the bright beam of my flashlight cutting through the thick, suffocating gloom of the attic space, illuminating piles of old, dust-covered furniture, broken mirrors, and rusted trunks left behind by the previous owners. When I finally reached the center of the massive room and pointed my light toward the arched front window, my stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot of pure terror. The floorboards directly beneath the window were completely covered in a thick layer of undisturbed, gray dust, except for two large, freshly made impressions that clearly belonged to a bare human foot, pointing directly toward the glass pane. Suddenly, the flashlight beam began to violently flicker and dim, the battery power rapidly draining into absolute nothingness despite having put in brand new cells just hours prior, plunging the far corners of the attic into a deep, terrifying twilight. Then a sudden, sharp wood creak echoed from the dark shadows right behind a massive stack of old wooden wardrobes, followed by the slow, heavy sound of shuffling footsteps moving directly toward me with a terrifying, deliberate pacing. I swung my flashlight beam toward the sound just as the bulb gave its final, dying flash of light, and in that fleeting second of illumination, I saw a tall, emaciated figure stepping out from the darkness, a man with leathery, bruised skin stretched impossibly tight over his visible ribs, his face completely devoid of normal eyes or a nose, featuring only a massive, vertical jagged mouth that split his head from forehead to chin, dripping with a dark, metallic fluid. Before the light died completely, the creature launched itself forward on all fours with an impossible, sickening burst of speed, its long claws tearing through the wooden floorboards with a wood-splintering screech that left me screaming in absolute, blind survival panic in the pitch-black void of my own home, realizing too late that whatever lived up here was not looking for a place to hide, but was actively hunting for its next meal. I thought the heavy vibrations shaking my new fixer-upper cottage were just structural damage from a severe winter storm, until I broke through a freshly cracked concrete wall and discovered a hidden, windowless subbasement with an iron door that locked entirely from the outside. The stone cottage was an isolated, single-story fixer-upper located deep within the rural outskirts of western Pennsylvania, a lonely piece of wooded land that I had recently purchased through a foreclosure auction with the intention of completely renovating the entire structure over the cold winter months. The structure itself was small, built entirely of dark timber and rough, hand-cut stone, sitting on top of a massive, ancient concrete foundation that felt freezing cold and damp even during the brightest hours of the afternoon sun. I had spent my first full week on the property tearing down old wood panels, replacing rusted plumbing fixtures, and cleaning decades of accumulated grime from the kitchen and living room. Completely isolated from the modern world with no internet connection and a weak, failing cellular signal that only worked if I stood near the edge of the front porch. By the sixth night of my stay, a severe winter storm had slammed into the valley, burying the gravel roads under 3 feet of heavy, drifting snow and cutting off the local power grid completely, leaving me entirely dependent on an old wood-burning stove and a collection of emergency wax candles for warmth and light. At exactly 2:45 a.m., as the wind howled like a dying animal through the dense pine trees outside, a sudden, heavy vibration violently shook the entire foundation of the cottage, followed by a loud, muffled crashing sound that seemed to originate from deep within the earth directly beneath the living room floorboards. Fearing that a major section of the old stone foundation had structurally collapsed under the immense weight of the accumulating snow, I grabbed a heavy iron crowbar and my brightest industrial flashlight, nervously stepping down the creaking wooden stairs into the dark, freezing basement. The air down there was intensely cold, heavy with the damp scent of wet concrete, old soil, and a strange metallic tang that made the hairs on my arms stand entirely on end as I scanned the stone walls for any signs of immediate structural damage. As I reached the far corner of the cellar, my flashlight beam caught on a massive crack that had opened up in the concrete wall, revealing that the stone facade was actually a false barrier built to intentionally conceal a hidden, narrow corridor that stretched straight back into the darkness beneath the backyard. My curiosity completely overriding my common sense, I used the iron crowbar to pry away the loose stones, stepping through the narrow breach into a secret sub-basement that was completely omitted from the property blueprints I had received from the local county town office. The hidden room was small, windowless, and carved directly out of the solid bedrock of the hill, containing nothing but an old wooden chair, a rusted iron chain bolted directly to the center of the floor, and a series of disturbing, frantic tally marks scratched deeply into the stone walls by what appeared to be human fingernails. I crept slowly into the center of the room, my heavy boots crunching loudly against the loose gravel, and when I shone my light onto the back of the wooden chair, a jolt of pure, unadulterated dread shot straight down my spine when I noticed a freshly written message scrawled in dark, wet charcoal on the wood. "We told you not to come back." A sudden, heavy thud echoed from the narrow entryway behind me, and I turned around just in time to watch in absolute horror as a massive, solid iron door that I had completely missed in the shadows slammed shut with a deafening metallic clang, locking me inside the windowless stone tomb. Panic completely overtook my entire body as I ran to the door, throwing my entire weight against the heavy steel, frantically hammering on the iron surface with a crowbar while screaming for help into the empty, unyielding silence of the storm outside. But the only response I received was a low, raspy, chuckling sound that began to resonate from the absolute darkness of the ceiling grid directly above the wooden chair, a sound that carried a sickening tone of pure, sadistic amusement. I slowly turned my flashlight beam upward, the light cutting through a thick cloud of falling dust, and my voice died completely in my throat as I saw a figure clinging to the stone rafters like a massive spider. A tall, skeletal man with unnaturally long limbs that bent at angles that completely defied human anatomy. His pale, leathery skin covered in deep scars while his wide, lidless black eyes stared directly down into my soul with a look of insatiable hunger. He opened his mouth, revealing rows of sharp, needle-thin teeth that dripped with a foul, dark fluid. And when he spoke, the voice that echoed through the small stone room didn't belong to a stranger. It was my exact voice, perfectly replicated down to the finest detail, whispering the words I'd said to myself just an hour ago before entering the cellar. fully aware that the heavy iron door had trapped me in a place where no one would ever hear my screams. I ignored a frantic handwritten note taped behind the headboard of my new bed, warning me never to look into the master bathroom mirror after midnight, until the horrifying moment my reflection remained perfectly still while my actual body turned away. We had been living in our newly purchased suburban home in Georgia for less than 48 hours when the first true signs of an active nightmare began to unravel the peaceful life we had envisioned for ourselves. The house was a beautiful, split-level property located in a pristine neighborhood with perfectly manicured lawns and quiet streets, which made the incredibly low sale price feel like an absolute miracle to a young couple trying to survive in a difficult economic market. The real estate agent had been strangely evasive about why the previous family had vacated the property so suddenly, leaving behind several large pieces of furniture and a garage filled with unpacked boxes, simply stating that they had relocated out of state for an urgent corporate opportunity that they couldn't pass up. It wasn't until my wife fell into a deep sleep on our second night in the house, exhausted from a grueling day of unpacking kitchen appliances and hanging heavy curtains, that I found the terrifying truth hidden within the master bedroom itself. I was sitting on the edge of the bed at 3:10 a.m., trying to organize a stack of legal documents and property deeds in the dim light of a bedside lamp, when a sudden draft of freezing air swept through the room, causing the flame of my emergency candle to flicker and die completely. At that exact moment, a low, rhythmic tapping sound began to echo from inside the hollow wooden headboard of our bed. A deliberate, slow sequence of 3 knocks, followed by a brief pause, and then 3 more knocks, as if someone was trapped inside the wood, trying to desperately get my attention. I stood up from the bed, my heart instantly racing, and pulled the heavy oak furniture away from the wall, assuming a loose pipe or a structural cable was vibrating against the drywall whenever the central heating unit kicked on. But as I shone my phone's flashlight beam down into the narrow gap between the bed and the wall, my eyes caught on a small, rectangular piece of faded parchment taped to the back of the headboard, covered in frantic, shaky handwriting that had been executed with a heavy black marker. With trembling fingers, I peeled the paper away and read the message, my blood freezing instantly in my veins as the words sunk in. If you are reading this, it means they didn't tear down the house like they promised. Whatever you do, do not look in a mirror in the master bathroom after midnight, because that is how he tracked your face, and once he knows what you look like, he never leaves the house. I let out a nervous, shaky laugh, trying to force my brain to believe it was nothing more than an elaborate, cruel joke left behind by the previous owner's teenage children to scare the new occupants. But the absolute, chilling seriousness of the handwriting made it impossible to dismiss the paralyzing fear that gripped my chest. Driven by a volatile mix of terror and a desperate need to dispel my own mounting paranoia, I slowly walked across the carpeted bedroom toward the master bathroom, the silence of the house feeling incredibly heavy, loud, and suffocating with every step I took. I pushed the door open, the hinges emitting a low, mournful squeak, and stepped into the darkness of the bathroom, my phone beam cutting through the gloom to illuminate the massive, pristine glass mirror that hung above the double vanity sinks. I forced myself to walk right up to the counter, taking a deep, shuddering breath as I raised my phone to look at my own reflection in the glass, desperate to prove to my subconscious that the mirror was completely normal and devoid of any hidden threats. For a brief second, everything appeared perfectly ordinary, but as I turned to walk back to the bedroom, my reflection in the mirror did not move. It remained perfectly still, its back turned to me, while a dark, shadow-like silhouette slowly materialized in the glass, right next to where my reflection stood. I froze in absolute, mind-shattering horror as the entity in the mirror slowly turned around to face me, revealing a tall, emaciated figure with leathery gray skin and wide, hollow eyes that carried a look of pure, unadulterated malice, its mouth splitting into an impossibly wide, jagged grin that revealed rows of black teeth. Suddenly, the glass of the mirror began to violently crack and spiderweb from the center outward, a loud, ear-splitting screech echoing through the small bathroom as the physical entity began to push its long, skeletal arms straight through the broken shards, stepping out of the reflective surface into the actual physical room with impossible speed. Its claws tearing through the drywall as it cut off my only path of escape to the bedroom, where my wife lay completely oblivious to the monster that had just claimed our new home, leaving me completely at the mercy of the shadow that now controlled my reality.